To commemorate the building of Fort Dummer in the winter of 1724, this marker, erected in 1901 by the colonial dames of Brattleboro and vicinity, stands at the foot of the Cotton Mill Hill in Brattleboro. The marker was originally located less than a half a mile to the south on the west bank of the Connecticut River at the actual site of the fort. It was moved in 1908 to its present location to accommodate the construction of the Vernon Dam. To better understand the need for a fort in this area, we need to go back in time to look at the settlements located to the south in Massachusetts. Settlers began showing up in the Connecticut Valley in 1670. Deerfield was settled in 1671 and sat at the very edge of English settlement for 40 years. It was a model of America's frontier, and its residents endured 30 attacks in 50 years, 2 of them with devastating results. Between 1673 and 1713, settlers attempted to establish Northfield as a settlement north of Deerfield. It was destroyed and abandoned twice, but finally became permanent in 1713 and it was incorporated in 1723.
Well, let's start with why they built Fort Dummer so long ago. I'm sure all of you have probably heard about the Deerfield massacre that was in February of 1704. It was in the middle of the night. Imagine it, very, very cold. And there were 200 French and 150 Indians. That's 350 of them. And they descended on Deerfield. They killed 47 people, took 112 prisoners. And of those 112 prisoners, 19 of them were killed on the way back to Canada. What some of you may not know is that that group left their sleds and their dogs right in Brattleboro at the mouth of the West River. Well, that, of course, was a disaster. Some years after that, there was a dispute between Massachusetts and Connecticut about the southern boundary of Massachusetts. They each contested it, said they owned more of the land. So they decided they would have the surveyors survey it again, and they would abide by whatever they said. They did that, and the surveyors decided that Massachusetts owed Connecticut some land. Now, they were not about to change their southern boundaries. They liked it where they were, and they weren't going to give up that land. So what they did was give Connecticut some land north of their settlements along the Connecticut River Valley, where we now live. And they called that the equivalent lands. And if you delve very deeply into Brattleboro history, you will understand that term of equivalent lands. Now, of course, Connecticut really didn't want the lands way up there in the woods, so they sold those lands. And there was 44,000 acres in the towns of Vernon, Brattleboro, Dummerston, and Putney. And this was all great farming land, river bottom land. And it was bid off by people from Boston.
William Dummer, Anthony Stoddard, William Brattle, and John White, owners of the equivalent lands, met to divide up the land at the Green Dragon Inn in Boston, Massachusetts. William Dummer, for whom Fort Dummer would later be named, was the Lieutenant Governor and Acting Governor of Massachusetts. He would later donate his mansion in Newburyport, Massachusetts to establish Dummer Academy, more recently renamed the Governor's Academy. William Dummer died in 1761 and is buried in the Granary Burying Grounds in Boston, Massachusetts, among various notables including John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Paul Revere. William Brattle, for whom Brattleboro was later named, was a colonel in the King's Militia, a Harvard graduate, preacher, lawyer, doctor, and legislator. He died in Nova Scotia in 1776 during the outbreak of the Revolutionary War.
And that is why we get so many of those names. Dummer is Dummerston, Fort Dummer, and there are streets in Brattleboro that use that name. Also Brattle. We had Brattle Street and Brattleboro. And the names came from the original investors, who never set foot on this land, incidentally. But they broke up the land and sold it to various people. And about this time, Massachusetts realized the danger of the Indians coming down the river. They remembered Deerfield Massacre very well. So they decided, the Massachusetts legislature decided in 1723, that they would build a so-called blockhouse on the river and post in it 40 men, English and Western Indians, for the purpose of protecting settlements south of there, the first one of which was Northfield. And this is how Fort Dummer was planned. It was to protect the settlements south of Brattleboro.
This very rough drawing shows the initial proposed plan for Fort Dummer, which evolved into this more formal concept.
It was begun in 1724, again in February, in the middle of the winter. People came up from Northfield, crossed the ice with their teams of horses, and started building the fort in the middle of February. It was under the direction of John Stoddard. They had 3 carpenters from Northfield, 1 John Crowfoot, an Indian from Springfield, 12 soldiers with narrow axes, and 2 teams. Some of these terms you will realize are historic because I speak in the language that the records are written. It was in shape an irregular rectangle varying from 85 to 150 feet, 2-story houses in the corners, smaller houses along the walls, built of yellow pine. For armament they had 4 swivel guns in the corners and 1 great gun. Now the great gun was a cannon, and we know the size of that cannon because the twin of that cannon is in the Deerfield Museum. It seems that when the English came over here to have a peace conference with the Indians, they brought with them a brace of cannon and gave them to Deerfield. And when Fort Dummer was built, the Deerfield people said, well, we will give them one of our cannons. Now you realize that a huge cannon like that is really not much good against Indians who hid against behind the trees and didn't present very much of a target. And that was not the purpose of the gun. It was for communications. Back in those days, there were no highways, no vehicles, no jets flying overhead. There was nothing but the sounds of nature. And when that gun was fired, that cannon was fired at Fort Dummer, the people in Northfield could hear it. So of course, when they heard the cannon fire, they jumped on their horses and rode pell-mell up here. And of course, by that time, the Indians had done their damage and gone. But that is why they had it. The other armament that was useful that they had were so-called swivel guns. They had 4 of them, 1 in each corner of the fort. And they indeed were miniature cannon, perhaps 3-4 feet long, mounted on a swivel with a wooden handle like a shovel handle behind it so that you could grab that handle and move the cannon around, aim it wherever you wanted to. And those cannon can be seen today if you go up to Fort Number 4 in Charlestown. They have some swivel guns up there. I forgot to mention when I told you about the building of the fort that this land, this 44,000 acres in the Connecticut River towns, was sold for a farthing an acre. A farthing is an old term for a coin which was in value 1/4 of a penny. How would you like to go out today and buy a few thousand acres of the river land along the edge for 1/4 of a penny? It's not going to happen. The fort was finished in the summer of 1724, and of course you realize it was built as a military fort, military post. And so the people that were there were soldiers, and there were some Indians to help them out. And the soldiers did bring their families to the fort. The fort was actually only attacked one time, and that was on October 11th in 1724. There were a number of Indians that were there, and there was probably about 70 Indians, and 4 or 5 of the occupants of the fort were killed or wounded. And I find it difficult that they couldn't decipher which was which, killed or wounded. But anyway, that was the only time that they were killed there. But there were many incidents near the fort. They didn't tangle with the fort itself, but at the mouth of Broad Brook and on the Hinsdale side, there were many skirmishes, and a good number of people were killed. As you probably know, in the French and Indian Wars, they were sort of on again, off again, and one year they'd be fighting away, and the next year they would be sort of friendly with the Indians. Anyhow, in 1728, that's 4 years after it was built, a trading post was established, and many Indians came to trade there. The Americans were giving them a better deal than they got up north, on purpose. Of course, they wanted the Indians on their side. So they, for a time, did have a trading post there. In 1730, Ebenezer Hinsdale became the chaplain of the fort. And in 1742, he moved across the river and established a small fort and a mill. Being a military post and having soldiers in their employ, the fort decided what they would have for rations. The rations for the garrison at Fort Dummer were to each man 1 pound of bread and half a pint of peas or beans a day, 2 pounds of pork for 3 days, and a gallon of molasses for 42 days. While they were outside the fort on the march, it was 1 pound of bread, 1 pound of pork, and a gill of rum. I suppose the rum was to drown their sorrows. A gill is 1/4 of a pint, so they couldn't get very drunk on that. But there was salmon, trout, shad, and many other fish, and there were moose, deer, bear, mountain lions, wolves, and small game and fur-bearing animals were also in abundance. So a great deal of their food, while they were at the fort, of course, came from hunting and fishing, and it was plentiful and relatively easy for them to get. New boundaries that were set in 1741 left the fort in New Hampshire, but Massachusetts continued to support it because it was in their own interest. The river south of here, of course, went directly into Massachusetts, and they were the ones that were trying to protect against the Indians. In 1752, the garrison, the number of soldiers, was down to 3 men, but in 1759, was back up to 9 men. It varied according to how the Indian Wars were going. The fort ceased to be a military post in 1760, and of course they pulled all the soldiers out. Nathaniel French and his son William, who was killed at the courthouse in Westminster, lived at the fort in 1769. From old records, the fort appears to have been standing in 1772, but probably did not remain long after that. There was a ferry where Fort Dummer once stood across the river that was used for many years. The cemetery that was used at the time of Fort Dummer is still in existence. It's a lovely little cemetery with mostly old slate stones. And that cemetery is directly across the Connecticut River from the site of Fort Dummer. It is thought that the other way towards Guilford was, in those days, a swampy area right over to the foot of very steep hills, and therefore really not a very good place to establish a cemetery. So this way they brought their dead across the river in a boat, and a relatively short distance. It was uphill, but it was a relatively short distance to this lovely little cemetery which still exists today.
According to an August 14, 1896 newspaper article, the Pecomtuck Valley Association held its 26th annual field day at the old Brooks Farm on the west bank of the Connecticut River. 2/3 of the farm stood within the former site of Fort Dummer. 1,500 people, including residents of Brattleboro and Vernon, and visitors from New Hampshire and Massachusetts attended the event, with some arriving by the morning train which stopped at the site to leave people off. The outline of the fort had been carefully surveyed and marked with stakes and broad white tape. Draperies of flags were hung to indicate the two main entrances. In his address, Vermont's ex-governor Levi K. Fuller urged that a permanent monument be set to fix the bounds of the old fort, and it was in 1901 that the colonial dams of Brattleboro and vicinity erected such a monument. To better understand what happened to the site of Fort Dummer, this aerial map shows the Connecticut River as it flows under the Hinsdale Bridge, which connects Vermont and New Hampshire, past the site of Fort Dummer to the Vernon Dam. The river, which flows approximately 400 miles from the Third Lake in northern New Hampshire to Long Island Sound, drops 2,000 feet over the course of its journey. With its many falls, the river had attracted mills since colonial times. In 1903, Malcolm Chase and Henry Harriman established Chase and Harriman, which grew into one of the largest electric utility companies in New England. In 1907, a potential site was identified in Vernon for a hydroelectric facility. An ambitious project that required raising the river and flooding all or parts of 150 farms. The monument marking the site of Fort Dummer was moved to its present location at the foot of Cotton Mill Hill in Brattleboro, Vermont, to accommodate the building of the dam. Construction of the dam began in 1907 and was completed in 1909. And so, the old Brooks Farm, which had been destroyed by fire in 1903, and the site of Fort Dummer went underwater. The first generator at the Vernon facility went online July 27, 1909, supplying power to the SD Organ Works in Brattleboro, Vermont.
I have known Peg and Jeff Barry for many, many years, and I was always interested in the history of Fort Dummer, of course, as the beginning of Brattleboro's history. And many years ago, Peg and Jeff showed me where Fort Dummer actually was. This knowledge has been passed down by a very few people in Brattleboro, and these few people, and Peg and Jeff, had been going down there for many years when the water was low. In those days, Vernon Dam had what they call flashboards on top of the dam. These were wooden boards that were put up temporarily on the top of the dam to raise the level of the water. And every spring, of course, when the ice came along and the huge cakes of ice went over the top of the dam, they severely damaged, sometimes took away entirely, these flashboards. And of course the water would drop, and it would have to drop even further when they repaired them. So it was during these times that these people in Brattleboro who knew where Fort Dummer was would go down when the water was low, and they would look and they would dig, and quite often you could walk down there and you could see white pipe stems out in the water, just laying on the bottom of the river in the mud. And they would pick up these things and occasionally a coin. So there were a certain number of people who knew where it was and had artifacts that they had found there. Now these artifacts, and I was among them, these artifacts were gathered out of context. By that I mean they were not where they originally fell. And this is important to archaeologists who are excavating an area, to record exactly where all these artifacts were found. If they have been washed out of the bank of the river and displaced, then they are no longer in context and they have only their own value. So you can pick them up and get what value you can out of them. But nothing was dug out of context. In 1976, the Bicentennial Committee in Brattleboro approached me to form a group and do a semi-formal dig in Fort Dummer that year. So I accepted that task and started in May to prepare for a dig in October. To do that, we had to have Vernon Dam draw the water way down, far more than they ever had before. So I approached them and they said, gosh, next spring we were going to do that because we have some work we have to do in the dam. We're going to draw it way down. And I said, well, how about doing your work in the fall so we can get in there and do this dig? And they said, well, we have all the materials we need for the job here, but we have to assemble work crews from far away. But they agreed that they would try, and indeed they were successful, and we had 1 week in October to dig when the water was way down. This was done on a semi-formal basis, or what archaeologists would call a salvage operation. There had been a large tree that had floated down the river. It had lodged right near the site of Fort Dummer, and the current of water that had been formed by this big tree was eating away at the bank and washing Fort Dummer artifacts down the river. So that's why it is called a semi-salvage operation. But we did it properly. It was all surveyed, markers were set, and we laid out grids of 1 meter square, and we dug 15 centimeters in each grid square and kept those separate. So when we had artifacts that would come out, we had the grid labeled and the depth labeled. And we dug in this fashion. We had 5-gallon paint pails, which we had cut off about 6 inches high, and we had put hardware cloth across the bottom. And the material we dug went into these buckets. They were carried over to sluices that we had built, which is a U-shaped channel lined with metal that you could pour water in the top and it would run down the channel and into the river or wherever it was set. And we had pumps that had been donated that we pumped water out of the river and through garden hoses. So when a bucket of earth was brought over to the sluice, someone with a garden hose with a nozzle on it would splash down through the bucket and wash the mud and sand away, and you were left with a coating of small stones and twigs and perhaps an artifact or two. Anyway, the sluicers did just that, and then they dumped the contents on sorting tables, and different people, but very patiently with their 2 hands, sorted over all the stones and debris and looked for artifacts. And every one was saved, no matter how small. And we had a great mixture of people there. We had professional people, laborers, housewives, nurses, athletic coaches, retired geologists. We had the best person with the sharpest eyes on the sorting table was a man named Lex Nason, who was a retired geologist who spent his career in the gold mines of Africa. And he was great. He could spot things long before anyone else could. And we worked. That was awfully hard work. It was very hard work. We had cut a road down there, and it was almost a quarter of a mile long. And we had a crew of volunteers with chainsaws, bush saws, and any equipment that was necessary to cut down and smooth out a road so we could get a backhoe down there. And the backhoe came in, and we had about between 3 and 4 feet of what we call overburden. This was sand and dirt that had been washed over the site of Fort Dummer for all these many years. So we had to dig down through all of that stuff to get to fertile ground where we could find artifacts of Fort Dummer. And digging 3 to 4 feet of that away over a fairly large area was not something you do with a hand shovel. So we had a very large backhoe down there, and we had a problem with that because it had been donated, but it was way off up north somewhere working on a job, and the job didn't go as fast as they thought it would, so it came the day before we were supposed to start digging at Fort Dummer, and we still had 3 to 4 feet of overburden over it. But that night, supper time, it came down, so I went down there with the operator and a flashlight, and in that night before, we uncovered the site of Fort Dummer and piled it all up behind us, out of the way. That's how it started. And it took us a day or two to get all of our stakes out and our grids set and get ready to go. And we intentionally asked the reformer not to come down and make any news about it because we did not want extra people around. It just slowed everything down. So they did not. And at the end of it, we had them down and cooperated with them, and they gave us a wonderful spread in the paper. And we did find a lot of artifacts. Most of them were just little pieces of rust and such things like that, which do not mean much to anybody. But we did find some nice ones. They all went up to the University of Vermont and were curated up there. Came back to me because I was supposed to be the owner of all these when we were done, and I immediately donated it to the Brattleboro Historic Society, where they remain to this day. If you would like to see some of the artifacts from Fort Dummer, you can see my personal exhibit at the library. Here we are in Brooks Memorial Library, headed for the Fort Dummer exhibit. We're here in the Brooks Memorial Library at my exhibit of Fort Dummer artifacts. And this is where you can come if you were indeed interested in Fort Dummer and actually see many of the artifacts from that place and that time. Now, these artifacts are ones that I found washed out of the riverbank long before we did the semi-formal excavation in 1976. So I collected them for many years after being told where Fort Dummer was by Jeff and Peg Barry. So what we will do today is just point out a few of the artifacts and explain what they are. There is a book in the drawer in the bottom of this case which has descriptions of all the artifacts and life and times in this area at the time Fort Dummer was in existence. We'll begin on the bottom shelf. These articles down here in the corner, those actually came from an old flat iron. They're pie-shaped pieces of metal, and they were warmed over the fire, and the iron was made out of sheet metal, and these were placed inside the iron. And when one got cold, you took it over and dumped it out and put another hot one in, and continued on with the ironing. This was a part of a large pot or cauldron. They used many of them. This is one of the legs. They had 3 legs, and they were used to heat soups and stews, which they used a lot of in those days. They take their fish they caught in their game and put it in a pot, put some water in there, and away they go. These articles down here are the remains of belt buckles. Just plain old belt buckles, nothing very fancy. This is a mystery item. We don't really know. Obviously it is lead. It's rolled up to make like a pipe. What it was for we don't quite know. These 3 articles were pieces of a gun that held the gun, the metal part, onto the wood, and they're broken pieces, so it's hard to picture where they came from, but that's what they were. This also is part of a gun. These 2 pieces were the mechanism that was connected to the hammer which you pull back on the rifle to cock it before firing. We found quite a number of pieces of guns. This is a flat lead sheet folded over with a very small ball partly through it. The only thing we can think of that somebody was having target practice and shot it, and this is the remains. We don't know for sure what that was. We're up on the second shelf. This I'm sure some of you know. This is part of a door hinge. This long piece was driven into one of the big beams with this pointing upward, and the other part of the hinge fit right down over this stub. These are still in use in old barns around here today. These are obviously handmade nails made by a blacksmith, one by one. This is part of a horse bit, that metal arrangement that is held in a horse's mouth to help guide him. This is very smooth, this stone. This was obviously a sharpening stone. We found 2 or 3 of various types of those. These nails are handmade nails too, and they are shorter. They were horseshoe nails.